Hi, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. And we are here tonight to talk about an upcoming game, Hammer and Sickle, that is currently on GMT's P500, designed by Alex and developed by Joe. I'm happy to have both Alex and Joe with me tonight to talk about the game, the history behind it, and the development process. And as usual, for those of you who are watching us live, first of all, thank you for being here, but also feel free to ask questions to our guests in the chat. I will bring them on in the discussion. For once, I don't have a very strict structure for the interview, so it's going to be pretty much free flow. So I will bring your question as they come. Thanks for those who are here. Just a quick reminder, if you wish to support the show, there is a link in the description to donate on Ko-fi, and you will get access to our Discord server. I believe that Alex is on our Discord server, actually, and we do a lot of stuff over there. We play games together in Le Club de Jeu, and we do a lot of cool stuff. It's a great community. It's also a good way to support this channel. Great. But I would like to start by thanking both of you, Alex and Joe, for taking the time tonight to talk about Alex's upcoming game. So we discovered Alex with Land and Freedom on the Spanish Civil War, and we just lost Alex, so that's awesome. But yeah, Alex released a game on the Spanish Civil War that was a cooperative game that both you and I, Joe, enjoyed quite a bit. And I was excited to hear that Alex is actually working on new games, new designs, and I wanted to see more of his work. So I was really excited to see that there was a new game that was picked up by GMT that is looking at a topic that is interested to both of us, which is the Russian Civil War. And there is always ongoing question about people asking more games about the Russian Civil War, specifically coin games about the Russian Civil War. And I think both you and I, Joe, we think that that wouldn't be a good model to actually do the Russian Civil War, especially as a whole. So I think it's really interesting. And Mark is asking what company publishes the game. The company is GMT Games, and it's currently available for pre-order over there if you go on their P500 page. Thanks Arnaud for clarifying, and Evan also for clarifying. So yeah, Alex, super happy to have you here. Maybe for those of you who might not have watched videos of you where you were on the channel, because you were here a couple of times actually, once for Land and Freedom, and I think once when we're talking about social movements and historical board games. I think it was with Joe, Yoni, and Richard Barbrook. I believe that we're all together. So maybe, Alex, can you, if you have an internet connection that is stable, can you present yourself? If not, I will ask for Joe to present Alex, if that makes sense.
Sorry about the issues. Hopefully it works out. I mean, to freedom.
It's not working out. I don't know, Joe, on your side how it is, but on mine it's very choppy.
It's quite choppy, yep.
Yeah. So, Joe, do you have at hand, as a good company man, a small a small presentation that you can do of Alex, apart from him being a big lefty?
Not much beyond him designing Land of Freedom, I don't think. But he's a man of mystery. Well, it's just me now, guys. I'm in charge.
No, it's not just you. I put you in full screen.
No, I don't.
In action.
I'm not sure I do. I'm not sure I can give you more biographical details for Alex, unfortunately. So we may need to wait for Alex to come back. But we could talk about the Russian Civil War.
We could talk about the Russian Civil War, I guess. So we can see you, but you're frozen, and we can barely hear you.
You could try turning off your video, potentially. That might help.
Yeah.
But then you wouldn't be able to see my face.
We wouldn't be able to...
what we can see is not worth it. And no offense, it's just because of the video quality. You look amazing. Yeah. I think you're a very handsome man, but I think that the video feed is not giving you what we want. Yeah. Okay, here. Great. Awesome. Thanks for being here, Eric. So Alex, can you hear us and can you speak? And
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Oh, awesome. That's perfect.
Yeah.
It would be awesome if you could pick up a narrow relevant image to replace your blank icon here, but I don't know if you can do that. In any case, can you maybe briefly present yourself for our viewers?
Yes. I am a game designer. If you've heard of my first game, Land and Freedom, it was about the War and Revolution. Came out last. Blue.
Nope, it's not working. Okay.
God.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I don't know what to do. Well, it's the thing of being live, I guess. Well, I'm going to start asking questions to you, Joe, then, in the meantime, to see if Alex can actually figure out his internet connection. The first thing that I would like to know is, so you've been a game developer for GMT for quite a while now. It became one of your main activity as someone is in the industry. I was wondering, how does it work with GMT regarding the projects that you are assigned to? Because when I see Hammer and Sickle, I'm like, yeah, I see Joe all over it. But what is the actual dynamic? Do you get to pick and choose? Do you have Jason Carr saying, I would like to work on this? What is the kind of relationship here?
Yeah, so mostly I work closely with Jason Carr and Jason's team. So Jason will often get a game submitted through GMT in some capacity, or he's aware of a game that GMT might be interested in. And if it's one he thinks will suit me either in topic or in style of game, or sometimes in terms of geographical proximity, so the designers in Europe, it's easier for me to work with. He'll get me to look at the game, sometimes give some feedback about the game before it's accepted by GMT to go back to the designer. And then I'll often, end up working on those games which he thinks would be a good fit. So, I can turn down projects potentially if I need to, but or if I want to. But often, me and Jason are on the same wavelength, really. So we can work out what kinds of games would be a good fit for me to work on. And this, of course, was a perfect fit.
Yeah, so it was a perfect fit, I guess, for the topic. So do you have maybe a personal interest in the Russian Civil War period?
Yes, I mean, I'm personally interested in it. I don't have any kind of personal connection to the war, as some people might. But I actually, before working on Hammer and Sickle with Alex, I'd toyed with designing my own games on some bits of the Russian Civil War. So me and you have talked about this before, and come to the conclusion perhaps that it's better to focus on particular theaters or kind of areas of the war, which is something Alex does a little bit here. We can maybe discuss with him later. But I previously designed a game inspired by a experimental failure, Red Flag over Paris. So I designed a game called Black Flag over Kronstadt about the Kronstadt naval revolt, which took place towards the end of the Civil War. That's a very small game. That's actually more or less fully designed, but was just kind of wanted to do as a fun little hobby. So I designed that, and Kronstadt features heavily in Hammer and Sickle. And I also started designing or playing around with ideas for a game about Makhno and the Black Army in Ukraine, so particularly focusing on the civil war in Ukraine. And I never got that far with that idea, but that was an area I put quite a lot of work into doing some researching because I was quite interested. And there's an obvious theme connecting these, which is anarchists in the Civil War, basically. That's my kind of main interest. But more broadly, I guess I'm particularly interested in the kind of local revolts that happened throughout the Civil War. So another example is there's a big revolt in Tambov happens in the center of the kind of Western Russia region. So all these kind of local peasant revolts or kind of smaller revolts, often SR inspired, going on, and also some of the strikes in the city and some of the tensions within the left during the Civil War, I guess, is something I'm quite interested in, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's one of the interesting aspects, and that's why I was also so excited that Alex was making a game, because his first game was definitely about the tension between different leftist factions. So having Alex doing a game on this topic was definitely up my alley. And it's interesting regarding your game on Ukraine. So Alistair, that was one of the guests during the Clean Wehrmacht stream, is actually making a coin adjacent game on that same theater. So I'm actually curious to see what he comes up with. Very interesting.
I'm very excited. I was excited to see that. And if you're watching, Alistair, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear more about the design at some point.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking about putting you two in contact, because I think that would be a really interesting discussion between the two of you. Alistair might jump into the chat at some point. He was trying to make himself available, but if not, I'm pretty sure he will watch this afterwards. And so there is a message now for him. So Alex, we see your face. We can hear you. This is great. So
Can you hear
going
me
back
now?
to, yeah, we can hear you fine. Going back to you, I think we can probably jump into the topic of the game. I was wondering what motivated you to make a game on the Russian Civil War.
Yeah. I'm very interested in making games about social change and inspiring social change. The Russian Civil War, Russian Revolution, 20th century of the icon. So obviously, as an activist, as an organizer, you naturally are drawn towards learning from the history of the world and how they succeeded or failed to inform future struggles. So yeah, I mean that was the obvious to start. I first started on the Spanish Civil War game. So I've been working on Hammer and Sickle now for 5 years. And I would say motivation is to show how they're for just a simple red and white conflict to competing states or ideologies, but that there are all these insurgents and peasant movements and workers' movements and different nationalities trying to break free of the Russian Empire. So that's a big part of the motivation for the game, is to show to expand the realm, the complexity of what was going on in that conflict.
And so it dropped off a bit, but you were mentioning this when you were talking, and it links to a question that Mark was asking in the chat, asking how many players are required to play the game. So it's a 4-faction game, but is the player count variable?
Yeah, so it's a 4-player game. There's 4 factions, but we have bots that we're developing for less than 4 players. So you can play solo or up to 4. Lately, I've been doing a lot of testing with the solo bots. So
who's working on the solo bots?
Well, in theory, Joe and I are both working on that diligently, but I think I don't know. Joe can speak to the dynamics of how GMT prioritizes his many projects that he's studiously working on. But so mostly at this point, I've been developing the bots.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, what's going to be the bot systems? Is it going to be a coin-like system with a sort of flow chart with different actions depending on the situation? How are you tackling creating a system for those solo bots?
So the goal for this game really is to make something that's as interactive and accessible and easy to learn and play as possible. So I would say it's much lower complexity than the coin system. Really, with my designs, I start with the history, and then the goal is to try to get as many people as possible interested in that history. So to make the most viral type game that can be, just maximize the fun, the joy factor. So keeping it simple. The bots mainly are just a simple random choice within limited confines of what they're going to be doing. So you're always you have some idea of what they might be doing, but you're never able to completely predict, and you have to just respond with a little bit of creativity.
And going back to the history of the game that's behind the game. So you said that you've been working on this game for 5 years. What would you say were the most influential books that had an impact on your depiction of the Russian Civil War in this game?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of great sources out there. I mean, there's a lot of bad sources too for the Russian Civil War and Revolution. But lately, I think the best overall general history book that I could recommend is this one by Jonathan Smeal, The Russian Civil Wars, 1916 to 1926, because he covers not just the red and white dispute that everyone knows, but he really broadens the picture to include all the different insurgencies and nationality struggles that were going on. peasant movements and so forth. So I'd say that's a good starting point for anybody who's interested in the overall topic. Me coming from more of an activist, background, I was naturally drawn to the Makhnevist movement in Ukraine. So I would recommend, this book just came out last year by Charlie Allison called No Harmless Power on PM Press. That's a good, very lighthearted history of Nestor Makhno and his movement. And lately I've been really enjoying on audiobook a book called The Vanquished by Robert Gevart. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but looking at all the conflicts and revolutions that happened in Central and Eastern Europe after World War I, and understanding that conflict didn't really end for most of Europe after 1918. There was quite a lot, and Russia was the sort of epicenter of all that unrest, but it had echoes all throughout the continent. So those are three good books I'd recommend. But if you're not a book person, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast is fantastic. It's incredibly long. The Russian.
Yeah, I was about to say, listening to his series on the Russian Civil War, you probably have the time to read 2 or 3 books on the topic. So yeah.
Yeah, or 10, because it's like 150 episodes just for the Russian series. And then another really good one that I don't know how many people have absorbed, but the Great War YouTube channel, they were following World War I, week by week, 100 years later. They continued past 2018 to cover quite a lot of the Russian Civil War and all the various conflicts within and around it. So there's a whole lot of fantastic videos that they produced a few years ago on YouTube under the Great War channel.
And it's a great channel, and they have this habit of focusing on smaller topics and go in depth as much as possible within the 20-minute time frame. And I think they are really, really well made. I have a question here from Alan that relates to what we're talking about. Alan is asking, how did you determine the 4 factions when there were so many different conflicting groups in the Civil War? And that's an ongoing topic in all Russian Civil War games. Like you have to represent a lot of the smaller factions, but it's really hard to know where to stop and what to represent and not represent, and how do you make up actually 4 major factions?
Yeah, that's a great question. You could draw the line in so many different places. For me, I kind of grouped all of the independentist movements into one faction called the New Nations. So, for example, all the parts of the Russian Empire that were attempting to break away from the Russian Empire when the Tsarist regime collapsed. Everybody from Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, the Caucasian, area, Central Asia. So, I mean, you could, if you really wanted to, you could have each of those be their own factions and get really into it. But I don't see how that would increase the amount of accessibility or approachability of the conflict. So for me, I just grouped them all into one sort of New Nations faction that's sort of pursuing the idea of Joseph Pilsudski's, attempted alliance of the intermarium between all these countries that were going to go from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to fight off the Bolshevist revolution. So that's one representation. That's obviously it's an oversimplification, but
but they share the same objective, so it made sense to regroup them. Yeah, right.
And then in terms of the anarchist faction, it's an amalgamation of a lot of things. It's basically all the left-wing uprisings and peasant revolutions and or rebellions, the Makhnevist movement, the Kronstadt sailors, all the left-wing opposition to Bolshevism, and that way you kind of have a clean, weak alliance system in the game where there's 2 revolutionary factions of the anarchists and the Bolsheviks, 2 counter-revolutionary factions of the New Nations and the Whites, and that's kind of the core dynamic of the game, is that you have a weak ally. Whatever faction you're playing, you have an ally who you're kind of working together to sort of keep the victory tracker on your side of the board. But ultimately, that you're going to end up betraying them, or they're going to betray you at some point because your agendas are completely opposed. The White movement was not remotely interested in all these new nations splitting off from the Russian Empire, for example. So,
is there opportunity in the game to have counter political kind of alliances for just for realpolitik objectives?
Yeah. I mean, certainly, like it's a game where there's a lot of negotiation, a lot of openness in terms of, you can betray anybody at any time, and you can make deals. Or, I mean, it's tough to say that you can ally. Like if you're playing a revolutionary faction, you're not going to make a permanent alliance with really anybody. Certainly not a counter-revolutionary faction, but you might have moments where you need to barter or make a deal or something to go against a common enemy, because ultimately only one faction can win the game. So there is no real strong alliance there.
And I mean, one stronger option, just to say it is in the game, is you can form a temporary military kind of link with anyone at any point for any battle. So you can come in as the new nations and support the anarchists against the White Army, for instance. That's something that can happen just for that one off of that one battle.
But it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's great that it's there, because there were some weird dynamics that made that people that were on the opposite side of the political spectrum had similar interest. I mean, I know that the whites really like the Kronstadt uprising, for example. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, you said that you were interested by the topic from an organizer point of view, from someone who comes from a political background, and you were saying that for you it was interesting to learn about other revolutions and events that were pushing social movements to learn something. And I was wondering, working on this game and researching the Russian Revolution, what you say that you learned out of this, and things that you have in mind that makes you change maybe your perspective on your own activism?
That's a great question. I think it's the main thing I've learned is that it's really complicated. It's really, really complicated. You could drill down on so many different aspects of how the Tsarist regime first collapsed, the army's refusal to fight, the peasants and the workers fighting against their own immiseration, taking land, taking factories, all these things. That's like the hopeful side of things, right? That if you're hopeful that some kind of revolutionary change can happen in the 21st century, you're looking at that part. But if you're asking about like how to actually make a revolution that sticks, there's so many contradictions, so much violence and brutality and things that are really hard to get jazzed about. The history of the Russian Civil War, and I mean famine and typhus epidemics and all these horrible things that happened. So many people lost their lives. It's a grim picture. But just in terms of me personally, where I'm coming from, I'm wearing a shirt that says capitalism is organized crime. So obviously I don't really believe that the current system can continue forever, or that it should. So you have to get inspiration from somewhere, whether that's historical events like the Spanish Revolution or the Russian Revolution. But I think really those things can only inform you up to a point. You can only get so much, instructions, I guess, from these events, because ultimately the conditions that we live in today are so different from what a Russian peasant was dealing with 100 years ago. Yeah,
of course. And through that process, and I'm going to ask the question to both of you, because Joe, you've been reading a lot about the topic. As you said earlier, you at some point were designing a game on Kronstadt. During this research, you actually reached a point, or a few times, it might have happened a few times, where you learned something about the Russian Revolution or Civil War that you didn't expect. And I know that, Joe, we had a couple of discussions on Kronstadt and some of the views of some of the anarchists, but I was just wondering, were there those moments where you're like, oh, my perspective is slightly changing, that I'm researching for a game design project?
I'll jump in, I guess, first. I mean, one thing I was struck by and I was aware of, but wanted to make sure I learned more about, was the degree and impact of anti-Semitism, particularly in the Ukrainian part of the Civil War. I mean, and in other places as well, and how that was dealt with, particularly by Makhno and by the Black Army, because there were accusations of anti-Semitism against Machno, which were made, and from my, not that detailed, but somewhat detailed reading, it seems to me that he personally was quite staunchly opposed to that, but there's a quite common kind of latent anti-Semitism among lots of the rural population and so on, and that's something which they had to deal with as a movement, and I think it's interesting to look at them doing that. He executed people for anti-Semitic attacks and so on, but it was still a problem, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and not deny that was something that was going on. So that's something I found interesting. Yeah.
And you, Alex, were there moments where your original views were challenged during the research process?
Well, just building off of what Joe said, I think anti-Semitism, the extent to which that, permeated the entire conflict on all sides, but particularly how it was there were coordinated efforts by the counter-revolutionary factions of the whites and the new nations to basically draw a direct link between being Jewish and being a Bolshevik or being a revolutionary, and that drove so many moments of extreme violence that then bled over into the rest of Europe when the white movement in particular was defeated, and so many of those officers went to Germany or other parts of Europe, and led this propaganda of we have to oppose communism because it's some kind of Jewish thing or something like that. There are some books in particular that try to draw links between the defeated whites and their anti-Semitism, and then the nascent Nazi movement in Germany. I think it's interesting to explore, but I would say that the extreme ethnic violence there. I mean, obviously there's that continues today in different forms. There's a lot of different ramifications that are coming out of that particular conflict at that time, and there's a lot to unpack. It's not a simple thing of one group being pure or anything like that. There's a lot there.
But I think it's really interesting because you made a connection between what happened afterwards, and it's true when you're thinking about Ukraine, for example, like when the Second World War started and they ended up being invaded, you had groups that were nationalist groups that were based on one of their two features was anti-Bolshevism and anti-Semitism. I think Stepan Bandera's movement, which is a figure that is re-emerging today, which is a bit scary, is a perfect example of that. So there is definitely that connection there that I didn't think about to connect to the Russian Civil War. But you know what? Let's jump maybe into the game and have a look at what it looks like. So this is a TTS module. So just for people to know, this is playtest art, so it's not final art at all. The game will not look like this. By the way, do you have any idea of who's going to be the artist working on this, or it's not defined yet?
Not yet. You may have some ideas of people we could go to, Alex. I'm sure, and we could talk about that. But
yeah, but it's not defined. And before we start talking about how the game works, the overall system and all this, I have a first question here from Eric in the chat, who's asking, how long would you say is the regular playtime for a game?
Yeah, so it's come down a bit, I think, since we introduced the season goals as an alternate way of scoring. But usually, I'd say it's 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes longer for new players, but it's a pretty quick game.
Yeah. And I'd say it's fairly likely to end with an early victory, Alex, before summer 1921. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I think most of the playtests that we've been doing lately, it'll usually end in 1920 or late 1920. So usually season 4 or 5, it likely ends. Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, these are just early playtests. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, usually the game does not go the full length.
Yeah, and I think it's really impressive to have a 4-player game, so 4 factions with different objectives, portraying an event like this playable in 3 hours. Even if it was 4, I would be impressed. So I think it's very cool. And I've played it with Joe, and it was definitely fast playing, but it didn't feel simplistic. So that was something that got me excited. But it was an earlier version, and I'm sure that a lot of things have changed since then. But it was already looking pretty amazing. So yeah, can you give us a brief overview?
Yeah.
And I don't know which one of you is going to be more comfortable. Maybe Joe is going to move the camera and Alex is going to explain, and maybe Joe, you can jump in whenever you want. But I think what would be interesting is maybe to have an overview of what are the components, how do the factions interact with the board and with each other, and basically what you're trying to achieve as a faction.
Yeah, I'll let Joe control the TTS, because I suspect that TTS was the one that was screwing with my lag earlier, and I blame them personally.
Yeah, that might be.
But yeah, so just going over the factions, it's an asymmetrical game. So each of the factions is asymmetrical. They have different strengths and weaknesses, different components and cards and everything that they're using that are unique to the faction. So they all kind of work differently within the same sort of framework. The anarchists, just going alphabetically, the anarchists are spreading agitation around. So you can kind of see the green and black flames that they're adding to the board. This is agitation. This is kind of the unique token of the anarchists. What they're trying to do is put as much agitation out on the board as possible. If there's one agitation in a territory, that just means that the anarchists then can activate that territory for actions. Usually for all the factions, when you take a turn, you play a card, you activate one of your territories where you have troops, because that's a territory that you control. The anarchists are different in that they can activate any territory that has agitation in it, even if they don't control it yet. So what they're trying to do is really build up the level of agitation. If they get 2 agitation in the same territory, they can put the territory on strike, meaning that it won't produce economically. So either a hammer territory or a sickle territory. The hammer territories are the industrial centers that produce the firepower, and the sickle territories are the agricultural territories that produce food. Those are the 2 main resources in the game, food and firepower. So if you put 2 agitation, you put the territory on strike, it won't produce either food or firepower. And then trying to get the 3rd agitation in the same territory is how you create a rebellion, and that makes it into an anarchist territory. So the anarchists are the only ones that can actually take over territories without combat. If they can just spread enough agitation, they can cause rebellions, and they can spread around the map that way. The anarchists have very few troops and very little firepower. So a lot of what they're trying to do is carve out these niches where they can kind of start these rebellions, and then hopefully maybe barter with the Bolsheviks for some, food versus firepower exchanges or trades, to be a little bit opportunistic. The Bolsheviks are kind of the opposite. They're huge. They have the most troops, the most territories, the most ability to produce firepower with controlling all the industrial heartland. Their issue is really just having to feed the cities. They have so many hammers that they don't have enough sickles to produce enough food. And then in particular, there's 2 types of seasons on the game. There's winter and summer. And then depending on what season it is, the production is different. So in the summer, each sickle will produce 1 food, and each hammer always eats 1 food. But then in the wintertime, you need 2 sickles to produce 1 food. So for the Bolsheviks, this is their main weakness, is just feeding the cities and trying to find enough food, either by taking over those sickle territories or making trades with the anarchists, or using the food patrols to basically steal food from the countryside to feed the cities. However they can do it, they're trying to feed those hammers to produce their weapons. And then they also have the unique token of the armored train. The armored train looks a little different in real life than it does on TTS, but basically it's a renewable weapon. So in this game, the combat takes place through blind bidding. So you basically put your weapons into your hand, and everybody reveals at the same time what they're bidding. So there's a lot of bluffing and trying to get people to overcommit to certain combat to get an advantage. And usually when you're bidding firepower, you spend that to remove enemy troops. The armored train, you can use it every season. It's a renewable resource, and it basically represents Trotsky's train that he went from front to front to kind of bolster the red efforts. in the Red Army.
Wait, we just have a couple of questions. So Mark
Yeah.
is asking if the board is actually showing the starting setup, or
Yes.
is it a game in progress? Yeah. Okay, so it's the starting setup. And Joe, when Alex was talking about the different factions, I was wondering, could we have a look at those faction boards and understand how they maybe how they work, to have an overview of how the different factions function?
This is the anarchist one. This is very prototype, both art and layout. So we're actually going to have some of this on the screens, I think, eventually, which we have all of this on screens for factions. Alex, do you want to talk through what's on here, kind of loosely, I guess?
Yeah. So I guess the main thing is just that it's a player aid for. This is the anarchist player board, so you can see the season breakdown. Every season you start with events. This is where the sort of history comes into the cards, where you bid for the turn order, and then there's 3 actions for each faction. We go around the table 3 times in turn order, playing an action card, and then basically the propaganda, the economy, production, the counter-revolutionary factions get foreign aid, and then you kind of reset the board. This is also showing the combat sequence. I think maybe Fred mentioned it earlier, but when you're attacking a territory, and in this game, there's an opportunity for everybody around the table who's adjacent to that combat territory to support one side or the other. So there's a lot of interaction in this game, a lot of opportunities for people to try to make deals, try to negotiate, backstab each other, etc. So that's how the combat fits into that. And then each faction has different propaganda options that they can use. There's 4 different options for each faction that they can use in the propaganda round after the actions. And then on the top right of this, you can also see the different commander cards. Each faction has different commanders that they use in combat, and you're limited to only those in your action. So if you run out of commanders, you can't attack, you can't support, you're very limited. So there's a lot of scarcity in this game. Scarcity of commanders, scarcity of actions, scarcity of resources. That's part of the what makes it a very strategic game. It's just how limited you are in terms of the number of things you can do. So for the anarchists, for example, they only have 2 commanders, so they have fewer commanders than the other factions. The other factions all have 3 commanders. So yeah.
And so how do you win? That's the thing, because I can see that, yes, there's the geographical map and you're fighting for a sort of control and you've got this economical layer, but I can see that there are other tracks around. So you've got a morale track on the top, you've got something that looks like a victory point track at the bottom, and I was wondering what's the dynamic there?
Yeah, good question. So the way you win is by scoring victory points. The purple star that we have right now is the victory star. That represents the tug of war between the Revolutionary Alliance and the Counter-Revolutionary Alliance. So it's just reflecting the territories on the map and who controls them between the black and red versus the white and blue. So every time a territory changes hands from one alliance to the other, you move that star one step one way or the other way, just to show which alliance is controlling more of the map. And that's this is the target. So it's a moving target. You're trying to get enough victory points to inch in from the outside of the edge to hit that star, and the first player who actually reaches it, scores enough points to reach that moving target, they win the game. And then basically how you score points, there's 2 different ways. One is you have hidden objectives. In your hand, you have up to 2 objectives at any one time, and those are they're secret objectives, but they're also some information is given away to the factions of what you're trying to achieve. And then those range from 1 point up to 8 points. As soon as you're able to complete it, you announce it and you score those victory points. And then separately, there's public objectives, which are the season goals that we alluded to earlier. Each season, there'll be a particular season goal that everyone is competing over. And that could be like number of combats that you win, or how many hammers you take this season, something like that. So those score basically escalating as the game goes on. The first season, it's just worth one victory point, and then 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 6. So it also gives a little bit of a catch-up mechanism, or at least a potential for people who are behind to score a lot of points later in the game if they can prolong the game and try to win those public objectives.
And Joe, I was wondering, as a developer, what would you say were the main challenges for this game in the development process?
It's been a while. So we did some work, some kind of harder work on it, I guess, last year, and before that. But Alex actually brought the game in a pretty solid state. So I think it was more about evaluating some of the options available to players, and particularly around victory. So Alex alluded to the introduction of the season goals there. We also added an option to draw new objective cards in an easier way. So I think we were finding that players were getting a bit bogged down without any options to get new objectives sometimes. So I think it was mostly the objective season and the victory point stuff. I think most of the rest of the game was pretty solid, and it was more about balancing things. You know, we discussed adding or subtracting some of the sickle symbols, so where you produce food on the map and that kind of thing. So more minor tweaks. But this is an example of a game that was fairly easy to develop because it really came pretty much close to finish. I'd say Alex is a great designer who does very solid work by himself, even.
That's nice.
Yeah.
But
there is going to be more work on the solo mode, which we will do eventually, because I think originally you only have the solo mode for 2 of the factions, right? And we need to work on making sure that works well for all 4 of them, or the kind of non-player system anyway.
Yeah, no, like I said, I've been testing the solo mode recently, and it seems to be working pretty well.
Cool.
But yeah, that is something that I definitely want more testing to develop. And just real quick, to go back to the asymmetries, I won't take long on this, but the new nations, their token is nationalism, so they're trying to spread nationalism around the map, which gives them an advantage in combat as well as in mobilizing more troops. They also have the British Navy behind them, so they have more sort of mobility along the coastline. And then the whites their asymmetry is terror. So they're, and again, this goes back to the sort of pogroms and the anti-Semitic violence, as well as violence against workers and peasants and women. But they're trying to collect terror as a currency, and the terror that they collect, they can then use to fuel their engine, and so it creates another dynamic where the whites are very attacking. They get terror every time they take a new territory or conquer a new territory. It makes them very aggressive and attacking, whereas the new nations are mostly defensive, trying to hang on to their territory and not get steamrolled by the Bolsheviks and the anarchists.
Interesting. And so you mentioned the British Navy, and that's something that often people are not necessarily aware of, but that's the involvement of Western powers in the Russian Civil War, especially at the end of at the beginning of the Civil War, but it still lasted in 1919 and stuff like this. How did you manage to represent it in this game?
Yeah, so the main way is the foreign aid. The 2 counter-revolutionary factions get foreign aid every season from the West. So they get food and firepower from the British and the French and the Americans. That's the main way. And then the sea command that the new nations have is really the representation of the Baltic, British Baltic Fleet, as well as the British Royal Navy Caspian Flotilla, I believe it was called. And the French Navy in the Black Sea as well. So it affects the new nations in particular, but it's also just the whites. They can get more foreign aid than anybody else if they build up enough momentum. And yeah, that is something that what you said about the Western powers involvement is something that really is probably understudied, or at least most people wouldn't think about it when they think about the Russian Civil War, was the extent to which the British in particular had quite a lot of military intervention officers in directly aiding the White Army, and in all theaters. So
something to remember about the British.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have a couple of questions from the chat that I would like us to take. The first is from Joe Boyle, who actually has been rereading Dr. Zhivago recently, and he was wondering, do you ever draw upon creative sources? And this question is for the three of us when designing games or purely historical accounts of the period you're depicting. I think the latest game that I've done answers that question, so I won't answer. But I will ask maybe first to you, Joe, and then to Alex. Do you use some of those materials?
Yeah, I certainly like to read around, broader than maybe just history sometimes if there's other kind of culturally relevant things. But one particular thing I enjoy doing is trying to listen to music from a region or a kind of historical period, which I'm working on, ideally without any English lyrics, because I can work better to that kind of music. So yeah, trying to listen to some, 1910s Russian music while working on this would be a kind of interesting way to immerse yourself in time to some degree. Easier with some periods than others, of course, but there's lots of folk music from this era you could listen to, I'm sure.
And you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I think for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not sure how much you guys could hear what I was saying, but the way that my process kind of works is I start from the history and just get really, really into how to represent the history as accurately as possible. And then from then on, the last 5 years of this game in particular, it's just making it as fun as possible and just kind of moving away from a strict historical simulation to create a game that really, grabs attention in terms of the play. So I think for me, it's mainly just from other games that I'm playing, and the people that the other designers that I interact with mainly are in my group here in Philadelphia. None of them are really historical gamers at all. So the kinds of games that I'm usually drawing on in terms of for inspiration have nothing to do with historical games, and getting people to actually play historical games is something quite difficult for me. So that's why most of my designs are, just totally off the wall compared to, like I don't think I had even heard of Coin when I started working on this game. So
that's for the best, I think.
That is the best. I have a question. I have a question in that regard, actually. Had you heard of Coin before you called the end of round phase, one step of it, propaganda, or did that come to you independently, some kind of divine inspiration?
It did come. Well, both. I had heard of Coin by then, but it did come to me. I hadn't actually played it, so it was independent. And I thought it was funny the first time I played Cuba Libre. I was like, oh, okay, they do a similar thing here. But yeah, it just makes sense that it's like you do all the things that you're doing, and then you try to brag about it and say, look how great we are,
And there's a kind of lull in the fighting and so on. But anyway, that's the cartoonization of wargame design, everyone. Convergent evolution towards propaganda phases.
That's
heard it here first.
Interesting. And maybe one last question before we end this stream from Alan. And I think that's going to be a pretty fast one. Based on your research and political perspective, do you have a favorite faction, and what would be a happy result for you in the game?
Well, the anarchists would be my favorite faction, but the happy result as a designer is really that the players are having a good time. That's all I really care about. And so anytime I'm running a playtest or whatever, I just completely ignore my own politics or whatever, and I'm focused on the players and just making sure that everybody's, first of all, the game's balanced and fun, but mainly that that the game is singing the way that it should be singing, or resonating the way that it should be resonating with each player. And if there's a certain faction that looks like it's not quite as fun, maybe, or whatever, it's not hitting those notes, then that's what I'm looking for. So ultimately, like the game it's an educational game more so than like trying to steer people towards, hey, this is the faction you should support. It's mainly like trying to show the dynamics between the factions, the dynamics of the time period, and hopefully get people interested in learning for themselves about what these factions were about and what these movements were trying to do.
Great. But I think that's awesome last words for this stream. I would like to thank the two of you for taking time to actually talk about Hammer and Sickle. As I said, Alex, as soon as you have final art for the game before it actually gets shipped to people, I would be very excited to have teach and play of the game. So if you're interested in seeing this and you're watching us, well, I would recommend subscribing to the channel. You can also follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky to have some updates about the channel. And if you want even more information and support the show, you can donate on Ko-fi. You have a link in the description. But I'm really excited about this game. I'm always excited about more game about the Russian Civil War. This one looks like it's kind of an ideal point of entry also for a lot of players that are not necessarily historical gamers. And Joe has a thought. So what do we know?
It's a final closing thought. When are we gonna play SPI's Russian Revolution on stream with Alex?
So actually, so this is a good question. I think it would be good to time it with getting close to the release of Hammer and Sickle, but I wanted to do a series where we play all of the Russian Civil War game we can get our hands on, and then after that, having a panel discussion where we can we can talk about them. So I want to do all of them. And if you remember, I have this really big box of this. Professor in Edinburgh who made this big, amazing game on the Russian Civil War, and I want us to play it together. There is a TTS mod for it now, and we're in contact, and we're going to play for it. And I think it would be really fun to play it all together. It would be streamed here, so once again, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Russian Civil War nonsense. And Deborah, of course, teach and play. If you want to be joining us, Deborah, please let me know, and I will let you know when we do it. But I will keep in mind that you are interested. It would be great to have you on. And and we have a new pre-order. So, oh no, Evan probably has already pre-ordered, but yeah, definitely pre-order the game, support it. Where are you on the P500 for now?
477. I just looked. Yeah,
475 or so.
Oh, okay, so you're not at the 500 threshold yet.
Getting very close to it. So you could be the last 20 or so people watching the show now to order and get us over 500. That'd be super.
Yeah, so go for it.
And I will say, I'll be if anyone's going to be at the San Diego Historical Convention in a couple of weeks, I'll be there with Hammer and Sickle. You can see it there, and also at the PAX Unplugged in Philadelphia, where I live, in December. We'll be there as well. So say hi if you're at either of those conventions.
Great, but awesome. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for the two of you for taking time, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Fred.
Bye.